Good morning, Karen.
Good morning, Ron.
So I'm tickled we're going to get a chance to chat something through, and I have a perfect case study for you. I think this one's really going to push you, so this will be exciting. Ready?
Ready.
Okay. So I was just talking to a guy this week, and I've been coaching him for a while, not too terribly long. He has a history of coaches, and more importantly, what he has, in his own words, is he has a history of suffering at length. The short story would be that he just cannot seem to make peace with how his life is or what his life ought to be. And as a result, he would say that he spends at least, both professionally and personally, he would say he spends a lot of time suffering because he can't seem to get on board with whatever his life is or whatever he thinks his life should be. So what do you know about people who are long suffering?
Well, gosh, I know quite a few people who are long suffering, and I know a lot of people who do seem to suffer really needlessly, and from an outsider perspective, and maybe even from their own perspective. You had some interesting phrases. He can't make peace with his life or the life he thinks he should have, and so I guess that's what caught my attention first is what would peace look like to him? Sometimes I think we suffer because we get into a bit of it's such a routine, we don't even realize, unless we're talking with a coach or someone else, we don't even, we lose perspective. So that idea of we realize when we talk to someone else, wow, I really am suffering a lot. And so I guess my first thought is if he didn't have to suffer, what would he have instead? And I was talking to a client recently, and there are these ISIS attacks, and of course the media is sensationalizing them, and and this woman lives in a very remote part of the Midwest farmland. I mean, there are more cows and farm implements than people in this area, and she's concerned that ISIS is going to this Middle Eastern terrorist group is going to come and get her and her family, and so she is suffering incredibly by all these imaginations, these what ifs. So I guess reflecting back, it sounds like your client is long suffering with this sense that he can't have peace because life isn't the way he wants it. But I think we also encounter people who are suffering because of all these imagined what ifs as a result of external things like environment. So I guess that's the first thought is, where are our perceptions incorrect that are causing us to feel this sense of suffering and life isn't the way we want it? I don't know. What do you think about all that reflection, Ron?
Well, I get two themes out of that I'd like you to say a little bit more about. One is, all right, so you're describing a mismatch between expectation and reality. Okay, I mean, some kind of a mismatch, whether perceived or could be real or could be imagined, regardless. The other one that struck me that you said just a little bit earlier on was almost sounded like the question of whether or not he is attached to his identity as a sufferer. When you said, essentially, who would he be if not he who suffers? So those seem like two different themes. Maybe let's take the last one first. This idea of a mismatch between, let's just say, expectation and reality. Then let's come back to that identification with being the sufferer. So what about this mismatch, Karen? How do you fix a mismatch between one's expectations and reality, or one's perception and reality?
Well, gosh, so identity usually comes from somewhere. So in my life, my mom was a worrier, and so I guess you could say that's a form of suffering where she worried about anything and everything. If she didn't have something to worry about in her near life, she would worry in concentric circles outward about the world. So, maybe sometimes we are attached to this identity as a sufferer because that's who we are in our families and in our relationships. If you come from a family of sufferers, you got to suffer to fit in. So that might be one place that we get that identity. Another might be that we get some what's called secondary gain. If I have a really big problem, other people, give me love and compassion, like, wow, that's really tough. Again, it's sort of bonding over a problem. It's just I become separate and special because I suffer. And it might give me an excuse to not participate fully in life, or to hold myself back, or to just keep from being fully who I'm capable of being, which might be a little scary or uncertain or whatever. Even if I'm suffering, at least I know how to do suffering. I got that down pat. So maybe there's some things like that that your client is dealing with. As you think about the conversation with him, are any of those possible for him?
Sure. Well, I think he picked up as a child, what I might call he had a role of being a sufferer. It's not yet clear to me exactly why he had that role, but it sure looks to me like it was foisted upon him, or he adopted it, one or the other. So that would actually seem to be pretty true, this idea that he doesn't know who else to be except he who suffers. I mean, it's the role. He's 38, 39 years old, and so he's been playing that role for more than 3 decades, it appears to me. So when he comes and asks the question of me, it's like, well, why do I always have to suffer? And it's like, well, isn't that the question? Why do you have to suffer? Right? I mean, isn't that really what we're saying? Is that to examine why it is you are attached to that role? And here's what's funny about that, is what I realize as we're talking about Karen, is what he then does is he externalizes the cause. Okay? You got it?
Sure.
What he does is, I'm suffering, and then he starts looking outwardly for the cause of his suffering. Whatever, ISIS or some external factor, like your client. So he looks for an external source of his suffering, which is a complete distraction because the source of his suffering appears to be internally generated. How's that for a diagnosis? And what a great question. Why do I have to suffer? I love how you turned that back toward him. And also, as long as the source is outside of us, we're waiting for the external world to change. And boy, he's in for a long wait there. And so recognizing that, as the old saying is, happiness is an inside game. There was something else that struck me, though, when you said that, and I heard a great quote from an author, and I know I don't have it quite right, but if everything that I've lived up to this point is an illusion, if I didn't have to suffer, if I realize I've created it all, then what does that mean about me in the last 40 years of my life? It totally shatters everything that I've imagined to be true. And most people's psyches have trouble with that. And so if we're suffering, we in order to make sense of it, we have to find a cause, and so we cast about looking for what that cause might be.
And if you say, hey, there was never a cause, you just made it all up. I mean, who can handle that after, 20, 40, 60 years? So that might be some of what's going on for your client too, is the, sometimes as life gets better and we have less, there's a wonderful song on the internet by Karen Drucker, I've lost the right to sing the blues. And the idea is when life gets this good, you just can't complain anymore. You can't sing the blues. But so people's lives, maybe over time improve, and then they have to work harder and harder. Like, my client, she's actually got a really wonderful life, but she's casting about looking for something else to worry about.
So how do you then handle, assuming that it's typical, how would you handle, generally speaking, so the person is typically coming in with what they believe to be an externalized cause. There's something out there that is causing me to suffer. This is probably larger, potentially, even than suffering. It probably is true of many things. So how do you, and this sort of is like, okay, so this is the coachable moment for those who are listening. So, like, how do you direct one's attention from an external cause to an internal cause? And then once you've got your eyes set on, what's within you, what do you do with it?
That's a great question, Ron. So let's bring it down into, kind of our advice step by step. And I guess the first thing is, as your client did, to recognize, hey, I am suffering. To even create that awareness, like, I am suffering and I don't want to be doing this anymore. So you first have to make that decision, I don't want this anymore. And because without the awareness and the choice, you're just in it. You're the fish in the water. So that, to me, that would come first. And then the second step is to kind of take a step back and say, wow, where have I been focusing my attention that causes me to suffer? And I call that sort of taking responsibility for what's happening within you. So again, just as if you're not aware, you can't change something. If you don't take responsibility, you can't change it. And so to create that awareness, it says, what's the pattern of thoughts and meanings and behaviors that I've been doing that's causing this outcome? And so instead of desperately casting about for the thing out there that explains how we're feeling inside, we take responsibility that I created this feeling inside. Jack Canfield calls it, he's got a little formula, E plus R equals O. Event plus our response equals the outcome. We can't change the event, but we can change our response to the event, and that changes the outcome. And he calls that responsibility. So the more we choose to take responsibility for our feelings, our thoughts, that sort of thing, I think the more we're on the path. And then to choose something different, to say, okay, what do I have to change inside of me, or what can I control outside of me that would give me more of what I do want? If what I'm doing isn't getting what I want, then what do I have to change to get what I do want? So I'm sorry, Ron, I talked over you.
Well, no, I was going to say that was actually both an approach to the steps approach to how one does this. It was also a very sort of effective way forward and summary for what happens when people suffer and it being internally sourced as opposed to externally. So I actually have a closing question for you, which is, knowing that people who suffer, let's face it, they're suffering. So what thoughts do you have, let's say, from an empathetic or compassionate point of view about those who suffer, who come to us, either as coaches or even if we're just, loving friends and supporters? What's the perspective on compassion and empathy for those who suffer?
a great question. And, there are people who are legitimately suffering, people in the throes of serious illness or, big financial setbacks or, truly difficult situations what is it? Was it the Buddha who said, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, or something along those lines? So life is going to have pain in it. It's our framing of it that makes it suffering. But I think that pain brings us as humans together. I mean, think about 9/11, and that was tremendous pain, and in order to help alleviate that pain, humanity came together to reduce the suffering. And I think when we do come together and we have compassion and empathy and we support each other and we care about each other, if your client is using suffering as a way to try to get love and attention and connection, then gosh, what if he could get it without suffering? What if he could get it through being happy and fulfilled and in service to others instead of being separate and holding back? So that's how I would relate the idea of compassion and empathy. Let's do more of that without as a way to address pain, and so we don't have to have pain and suffering as a way to connect. So those are my closing thoughts, Ron. What are yours?
Well, I was you mentioned the Buddha, so I'm gonna offer this as a final thought, and I'm gonna go back to the heart of Buddhism. What I heard you saying is what a great place for us to practice loving kindness with others. The ability to just treat them with kindness, because if they're suffering rightly or wrongly, and at least we can treat them kindly while we listen or support them. So seems to me that's a fine take home for all of us. So Karen, it's been fun as always.
Yes,
thanks
you,
for playing.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.